Garrett Morgan, 58, lived in Portland, Oregon. For 30 years he worked as a park ranger in Forest Park, a place he knew in the finest detail. His profession required not only physical endurance but also a deep understanding of nature. Garrett was a military veteran who had served in intelligence, which left a mark on his personality and habits. He was meticulous, detail-oriented, and extremely cautious in his actions. Every day before heading out on his route, Garrett would check his equipment. He always carried 2 compasses, a primary one and a backup. His walkie-talkie was always in working order, and the batteries were replaced long before they could run out. On his belt he carried a knife and a whistle, essential tools for a park ranger. His clothing was functional and suited for any weather conditions. A green waterproof jacket with reflective strips, durable hiking pants, high-traction boots, and a cap with a built-in flashlight for working in low visibility. Garrett kept a logbook where he recorded everything he deemed important: changes in nature, animals he encountered, and weather patterns. These entries were precise and detailed, reflecting his approach to his work. His colleagues noted that he never left tools unattended and always acted thoughtfully. His intuition and experience had helped him avoid unpleasant situations on multiple occasions. Garrett's life was measured and predictable. He rarely deviated from his routine. In the morning, he always stopped by a nearby cafe for black coffee without sugar before heading to the park. His routes were pre-planned, and he seldom strayed from them without a reason. Those who knew him described him as someone who remained calm in stressful situations and always acted with a cool head. Garrett maintained good physical fitness. Regular medical checkups showed that he was healthy for his age. He had no chronic illnesses, and his vision and hearing were normal. His endurance allowed him to spend entire days in the park, despite challenging conditions such as fog, rain, or low temperatures. On the day of his disappearance, he left for work as usual, prepared for any conditions. His gear was fully adapted to the weather that day: foggy, with a light drizzle and temperatures around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. At the time, there was no indication that this day would be the last time Garrett was seen alive. The morning of the disappearance began for Garrett Morgan like any other. But within the first few hours, details that were unusual for him started to surface. He left the house a bit earlier than usual, dressed in his standard gear: a green waterproof jacket, sturdy pants, tall boots, and a cap with a headlamp. The weather was foggy, with a light drizzle and temperatures around 50 degrees, typical fall conditions for Portland, Oregon. On his way to Forest Park, Garrett stopped by his usual cafe, where he always ordered a black coffee without sugar. However, this time, he declined the order. The cashier, who knew him as a regular, noted that the forest ranger seemed agitated. Typically calm and composed, Garrett appeared nervous this time. He glanced around several times and then, without saying a word, quickly left the cafe. This behavior puzzled the cashier, as Garrett had never deviated from his morning ritual before. After the cafe, the ranger headed toward the park. A strong storm had passed through the area overnight, and Garrett planned to check the condition of the trails to ensure they were safe for visitors. He entered the trail through the main entrance, as always, with a radio on his belt and 2 compasses in his pocket. His observation journal, which he always carried with him, was in his jacket pocket. Approximately half an hour after starting his patrol, 2 joggers spotted Garrett about 300 yards off the main trail. They claimed he was examining something on the ground. According to them, he crouched down and carefully studied something in the grass or soil. The joggers didn't think much of it, as rangers often inspected the park's condition. However, they later recalled that his behavior seemed odd. Garrett usually didn't stray from the main trails without a good reason, and this time he was in an area rarely frequented by anyone. The joggers noted that the ranger was focused on whatever he was examining and didn't notice them. They continued their run without stopping. Later, during questioning, they said they didn't see any signs that Garrett was in danger. He appeared calm, though deeply absorbed in whatever he was doing. At that moment, There was no indication of what would happen next. Garrett Morgan continued his work as usual, though certain details of his behavior that day already seemed out of character for him. Skipping his coffee, appearing agitated, and straying from his usual route, all of this would later become part of a mystery that remains unsolved. The last confirmed sighting of Garrett Morgan was at a bench by the lake in Forest Park. It was found several hours after the ranger disappeared. His radio lay on the bench, turned on but with no signs of a struggle or damage. His colleagues later confirmed that the radio was fully functional and that Garrett always kept it with him. According to them, he would never have left it without a reason. Next to the radio was a broken compass. The needle was stuck pointing northwest, though the mechanism was damaged and the compass could no longer show an accurate direction. It was one of two compasses Garrett always carried with him. The second compass was not found. His colleagues noted that the broken compass looked as though it had been forcefully struck by someone or something. However, there were no signs of a struggle or damage on the bench itself or in the surrounding area. Faint tracks were visible on the ground near the bench, which was understandable given that it had rained the day before and the soil was soft. The trails in that part of the park were well trodden, but the ground around the bench remained undisturbed. Witnesses who searched the area later reported finding no foreign objects or suspicious detail. Some of the park's surveillance cameras were not working that day due to a power outage. This had happened before, and the park's technical service later confirmed that the outage was caused by damage to the cables following a nighttime storm. However, the working cameras near the lake recorded nothing unusual. The footage showed Garrett approaching the bench, but then the image either cut off or became unclear due to the fog. The park ranger stationed closest to the lake later reported hearing no sounds that might indicate an incident. No shouts, no noise, not even footsteps. He was in his cabin nearby, but visibility was minimal due to the fog and rain. According to him, he wouldn't have noticed even if someone had passed by. The forest patrol that arrived at the scene after the initial report of the disappearance also found nothing. No boot prints, no clues that could explain where Garrett had gone. His knife and whistle, which he always carried on his belt, were also missing. The bench and the surrounding area looked as though no one had been there at all. Relatives and colleagues later noted that Garrett would never have left his belongings on the bench without a reason. The radio and compass were essential tools for him, and he never went on routes without them. Additionally, that day he was wearing full gear, including a cap with a flashlight, which was also not found. The documents compiled at the scene stated that no obvious signs of violence or an accident had been discovered. However, the lack of tracks and the functional yet abandoned radio made the situation even more mysterious. Investigators later noted that Garrett could have removed the radio himself and left it on the bench, but this strongly contradicted his habits and character. The bench by the lake remained the last place where Garrett Morgan was seen. No other confirmed reports about his whereabouts after that have surfaced. The search for Garrett Morgan began immediately after news of his disappearance emerged. Forest patrol teams, search dogs, groups of volunteers, and local residents spent several days combing the territory of Forest Park. Particular attention was given to the area around the lake and the trails Garrett planned to inspect after the storm. However, no traces indicating his whereabouts were found. Despite the dense fog and light drizzle that complicated the search, specialists and volunteers meticulously examined every square foot of the park. The dogs trained to track people were unable to pick up any scent. This was especially strange considering Garrett was wearing a waterproof jacket that should have retained his scent even in damp conditions. The dog handlers noted that this could suggest Garrett hadn't moved through the park after he disappeared, or that his traces couldn't be detected due to heavy rain or other factors. Garrett's relatives and colleagues repeatedly emphasized that he was an extremely meticulous and cautious person. The skills he had acquired over years of military intelligence service and working as a ranger allowed him to navigate even the most challenging environments. According to them, he would never have gotten lost in a park he knew inside and out. In addition, his habit of always carrying a radio and compass made the theory of accidentally losing his bearings highly unlikely. The examination of the site where the radio and the broken compass were found also provided no answers. Experts discovered no signs of a struggle, foreign objects, or damage that could have indicated violence or an accident. Notably, the second compass Garrett always carried was never found. Some colleagues speculated that he might have taken it with him if he decided to leave the park voluntarily, but this contradicted his character. One of the main theories considered by investigators was the possibility of an intentional disappearance. However, Garrett's relatives and friends rejected this idea. They insisted he had no reason to vanish. His life was stable, he had no financial problems, and his relationships with his loved ones were consistently warm. Moreover, he had never expressed any interest in changing his life or disappearing without a trace. Another theory was an accident, such as a fall or drowning. However, searches of the lake and the nearby streams yielded no results. Divers examined the bottom but did not find a body or any of Garrett's personal belongings. Additionally, the absence of any traces in the soft soil around the bench ruled out the possibility that he could have fallen or been swept away by the current. Technical experts who examined the radio confirmed that it was in perfect working order. The last recorded signal was sent shortly after Garrett approached the bench. However, whether there was any conversation remained unknown. Colleagues speculated that Garrett might have left the radio turned on as a signal, but this did not explain why he didn't take it with him. Investigators also paid close attention to the broken compass. Experts analyzing the damage concluded that the needle could have frozen pointing northwest due to a strong impact or magnetic interference. However, the source of such interference remained unknown. Garrett's colleagues pointed out that he always thoroughly checked his equipment before heading out, and that the compass was unlikely to have broken by accident. Due to a power outage, some of the park's surveillance cameras weren't working on the day of the disappearance. The cameras that were operational near the lake recorded nothing unusual. The footage showed Garrett approaching the bench, but then the image either cut off or became unclear because of the fog. The park warden, who was in his cabin nearby, later reported that he hadn't heard any sounds that could indicate an incident. He noted that visibility that day was extremely low, and that he probably wouldn't have noticed even if someone had passed by. However, he also emphasized that Garrett was someone who always followed safety rules and would never have risked his life without a compelling reason. The search continued for several weeks, but ultimately produced no results. Garrett Morgan vanished without a trace in a park he considered his second home. His knife, whistle, and cap with a flashlight were never found. His colleagues and relatives were left wondering how an experienced ranger could disappear in familiar terrain without leaving the slightest clue about what had happened to him. During the investigation, the authorities focused on two main theories: an accident or an intentional disappearance. But neither was ever confirmed. The absence of any traces, the abandoned radio, and the broken compass made the situation even more mysterious. Despite all efforts, the search for Garrett Morgan reached a dead end, leaving more questions than answers. Several weeks after active searches had ended and the investigation appeared to have reached a dead end, Garrett Morgan's observation journal was discovered in one of the pockets of his jacket. It was a small leather notebook he always carried with him. Like most of his personal belongings, the journal was thoroughly examined by investigators. One entry in particular drew special attention. On a page dated exactly 1 year before the disappearance, it read, "They have returned. I hear their steps again. Only now they walk in rhythm with my heart." The reason this note was so intriguing became clear after forensic analysis. Experts who examined the handwriting remarked that it looked fresh, as though the entry had been made very recently, not a year prior. The ink also had not fully dried, even though the journal had been in the pocket of the jacket, exposed to moisture and fog. Specialists tried to explain this phenomenon. One theory suggested that the ink might have been of a special composition that dries slowly, but stationery experts confirmed that such ink is rarely used for everyday writing. Another version proposed that the page had been deliberately moistened after the entry was written, which would have slowed the drying process. However, when the paper was analyzed, no traces of additional moisture were found. Another baffling detail was the content of the note itself. The phrase, "they have returned," raised questions among both investigators and Garrett's relatives. Colleagues recalled that several months before he disappeared, he had become more withdrawn, shared his observations less often, and sometimes seemed distracted. However, no one paid much attention to this at the time, as Garrett had always been the type of person who preferred to keep his thoughts to himself. Relatives who reviewed earlier entries in the journal did not find any mention of people or creatures that could be interpreted as having returned. Most of the notes concerned weather conditions, the state of trails, animals he had encountered, and other typical observations of a ranger. The final entry stood out in stark contrast to everything else he had written, which added to the confusion. Investigators attempted to cross-reference the date of the entry with any events in the previous year. However, no significant incidents were found that could have been connected to Garrett's disappearance. His relatives confirmed that on that exact day, a year earlier, Garrett had been home and had never mentioned anything unusual. Experts also examined the handwriting. While it matched Garrett's known writing style, specialists noted that it appeared more tense and uneven than usual. This suggested the note might have been written in a state of stress or agitation. However, what exactly had caused such a state remained unknown. Garrett's jacket, in which the journal was found, was sent for further examination. Specialists searched for any traces that could shed light on his disappearance. However, apart from the journal itself, nothing unusual was found in the pockets. The second compass Garrett always carried was still missing. When Garrett's family received the journal, they carefully studied it as well. They said Garrett had never spoken about any threats or strange events that might have been connected to the note. However, they recalled that in the last months before his disappearance, he sometimes seemed to pause and listen intently to something. When asked what he was hearing, Garrett would wave them off and say it was only the wind. Investigators working on the case declined to comment on whether the journal entry could be linked to Garrett's disappearance. They stated that for the time being, it was merely one detail that required further investigation. Still, the note's oddity and the discrepancy between the date and the state of the ink made it one of the key findings in the case. Experts also examined whether the note could have been a forgery. However, handwriting and ink analysis confirmed it had been written by Garrett himself. The question of why the entry looked so fresh remained unanswered. Investigators did not rule out the possibility that it might have been part of a personal code or system Garrett used in his records, yet relatives and colleagues insisted he had never mentioned anything like that. The journal was returned to the family, but its contents continued to raise questions. The last entry, dated exactly 1 year before the disappearance, remained unexplained. No one could say what Garrett meant by "they have returned," or why the writing appeared as if it had been made only yesterday. This discovery added another layer of mystery to the case of Garrett Morgan's disappearance. Although investigators continued to search for answers, this note remained one of the most puzzling details, one that didn't fit into any of the scenarios under consideration.